So before I move on to the next playthrough, which is Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels, I wanted to talk about this arcade port of Super Mario Bros. Called Versus Super Mario Bros. Released in 1986. My first discovery of Versus Super Mario Bros. Was sometime earlier this year when I was working on my Donkey Kong and Mario Brothers videos. In hindsight, I don't know how a lot of these arcade archives that were released almost 10 years ago on the Nintendo Switch completely went over my head. I may have seen this game on the internet somewhere at some point in my life, and I probably completely forgot about it. If I have seen gameplay of this game before this year, then my most recent memory of it is earlier this year, back in August. I guess I completely missed the September 2017 Nintendo Direct where Nintendo announced that Versus Super Mario Bros. Was coming to the Nintendo Switch. Probably because I didn't even have a Nintendo Switch yet. The Nintendo Switch is 7 years old. I think about that at least 5 times a week.
I think about that 3 or 4 times a day.
In 1984, Nintendo released the Versus system. According to this article from the Super Mario Wiki, the Versus system is a collection of coin-operated Versus Dual System or Versus Unisystem arcade systems, and the games were designed for competitive play. The Dual System comes with 2 screens and 4 sets of controls, meaning it has support for 4 simultaneous players, which only the launch title Versus Tennis takes advantage of, not any games of the Super Mario franchise. The Versus system was designed in response to the video game crash of 1983 and the collapse of a proposed deal with Atari to distribute the family computer in the United States. Knowing that arcade gaming was still commercially successful in North America, Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi conceived the Versus system as a way to gauge consumer interest in Nintendo's home console games. The Versus system games were the last arcade games Nintendo of Japan released before leaving the business in late 1985. This was despite the high demand of Versus Super Mario Bros., which never had a physical arcade release in the country. The system had a longer life in North America. New games were released for it as late as 1990, and it was successful even enough to spur the development of the Nintendo PlayChoice 10. By the time Nintendo of America announced it would stop producing arcade equipment on July 31st, 1992, however, no new Versus games were coming out. The Versus games are mostly ports of Family Computer and Nintendo Entertainment System games, although many have notable changes in their graphics, gameplay, and difficulty. One exception is Versus Wrecking Crew, released a year before its Family Computer counterpart Wrecking Crew, from which it greatly differs. There's only a handful of Versus counterparts to other Nintendo games that were released for the Versus system. Aside from the games already mentioned, there's Pinball, Golf, and Dr. Mario, which is the only arcade version unavailable on the arcade archives for some reason. So, what can I really say about Versus Super Mario Bros.? Well, for the most part, the game is very similar to its original NES counterpart. It plays the same, it feels the same, it looks the same, at least for the most part. If you look at the HUD display at the top of the screen, you can see that all the text fonts now come with black backgrounds. Speaking of which, there is a triple-digit coin counter. But the coin system works exactly the same as usual. You collect 100 coins and you go back to 0. Which the game had me thinking that you could collect over 100 coins and the counter would just continue going, but that's really not the case. As far as levels go, that's where you're going to see a lot of different changes, especially if you've memorized the level design of the original version of the game. Really, all of the differences in the game are designed to make the game more difficult. With fewer warp zones and power-ups, more enemies, 6 new levels that would go on to be used in Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels. The original version of the game has some levels repeat. You'll get an easier variant of a certain level at the beginning of the game, and then later on you'll get the harder and more full version of that same level. For example, World-3 is the easier version of 5-3. World-4 is the easier version of 6-4. 2-2 and 2-3 are the easier versions of 7-2 and 7-3, and 2-4 is the easier version of 5-4. Most of the easier versions of the levels are replaced with the harder versions of the levels that were originally a part of the original game, and 6 brand new levels to the game, which would later be featured in Super Mario Bros. 2 The Lost Levels, are levels that bear resemblance to levels that were in the original game, but are much more difficult. There are a total of 23 different level changes from the original game. There's some minor changes, such as the ground before the final staircase being removed in World 1-3, replacing the Koopa Troopas with Goombas at the final staircase in World 3-1, prohibiting players from exploiting the 1-up trick, or some levels having a countdown timer of 350 seconds as opposed to the usual 400 seconds, like Worlds 4-1, 6-1, 8-1, and 8-2. One of the bigger changes I've noticed right off the bat is that there's no 1-up mushrooms anywhere in this game. Everybody knows where the hidden 1-up mushroom is in World 1-2. It ends up getting replaced and turned into another item block. And this pretty much goes for a lot of other levels in the game that have hidden 1-ups in them. Making sure that the only way that you would be able to get another 1-up is by collecting 100 coins. I like to think that Nintendo was trying to make this arcade port way harder than the original version of the game that was released on NES, to not only get people to spend their coins on this game so they can keep on playing, but to throw off the people that mastered this game and was expecting to go into the arcade and beat this game in a breeze as always, but that's not the case here. If the only versions of Super Mario Bros. That you've played are either the original NES version or the All-Stars version that was released on SNES, then this arcade port, this versus Super Mario Bros. Version, will probably catch you off guard and mess with your muscle memory, because it sure messed with my muscle memory. Specifically and especially when I got to World 7-4. The level design is largely the same as the original game, but they had to go and change the puzzle pattern in the maze. By the time I played this level in Versus, I had already had this level memorized in my head. I had already memorized the maze sequence. But here this game goes trying to change up everything. This level had me like SpongeBob in the Pickles episode. I already knew how to make a Krabby Patty before, and now you're telling me I'm layering everything all together in the wrong order. All of a sudden I've got to make a different order, making me think that I forgot the pickles. Instead of fighting Bowser, you may as well be fighting Bubble Bass. I think I played this level for a good 20 minutes before I decided, you know what, I'm just gonna go to YouTube. One of this game's biggest flaws when it comes to the mazes is that there's no sort of jingle or sound effect of any sort of kind to indicate whether you're on the right platform, which I'm glad they fixed in the All-Stars version. I'm just glad there's recorded footage that's been uploaded to YouTube by people of this game, which there really isn't a lot of because I only found one video that helped me with this freaking level. I imagine this level being the straw that broke the camel's back for a lot of people. Back when people were playing these versus machines in actual arcades. If I had ever seen an arcade machine and I got all the way up to level 7-4, there's no way. There's no way I would continue playing after that, because when am I going to have time to figure out a new pattern that I need to learn? This level was already hard enough to learn for a lot of people, and then when people finally learn it, then they go and play this version of the game and that pattern is suddenly changed and now you have to learn another pattern. I specifically highlighted World 7-4 for the fact that it really just messed with my brain, because this level would have definitely made me quit. As for the ending of the game, it ends in a similar way to the Lost Levels, where 7 toads gather together and they're circled around Mario or Luigi. The player is awarded 100,000 points for every life that you have left. But my take on score is rather simple when it comes to Mario. I think it's absolutely meaningless. But when I look at it as somebody who likes to watch numbers go up, it's pretty cool to look at. With all of that said, I don't think there's anything else that I really need to say about Versus Super Mario Bros. For the most part, it's just playing Super Mario Bros. All over again, and I've been playing it a lot recently, so the game is pretty fun to play. I mean, Super Mario Bros. Is already a really good game anyway, so of course this Versus version is good as well. I like how the developers put in the effort of making this game more challenging than the original, but I also find it really ironic that there's 6 levels in this game that would go on to be in Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels, which is the game that wasn't released in the US in 1986. But this Versus System version, which was only released in the US, was also released in 1986, just a little while before. Pretty interesting. Anyway, with all that said, thank you guys for watching, and the next game is Super Mario Bros. 2, The Lost Levels. Until then, have a blessed day and see you guys next time.